Hi, so I've been doing some Python analysis. This is a project I've been working on since 2017. Started soon after I learned Python at General Assembly. And so here's my code. I'm just going to walk through this. I have a data set. It combines a lot of information from a lot of organizations. World Bank data in particular is one of my biggest sources, but also from the Economist Intelligence Unit and various nonprofits like Transparency International. Basically, gather whatever data I can find that compares countries, and this is my basic code. I've abstracted a lot of it into a Python file, but that's not interesting. What is interesting is this. So what I did is I gathered a information from visamap.co. So all of this data is publicly available, and I imported it into my data set. And so that's where this visa free number is. It's saying any country that has, it says for the United States, 6 countries can come to the United States truly visa free, meaning no ESTA, meaning you just buy a ticket, show up at customs, show them your passport, walk in the door. That's visa free in my view. Um, and so I started with this. I blogged about this and said, okay, well, it's not tagging Canada properly. It should be Canada and Britain, but whatever. Well, the first finding here is that all of these countries, you find most democracies, once you hit a democracy score of 7 from The Economist, really 6.5, you basically are going to be around 100 countries visa free, basically other democracies. Now, the right wing in Europe is going to be changing that soon, but this has been true for the last 20 years. And the exceptions, of course, are these all British colonies, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the USA, Malaysia, and India. Um, which is very interesting that most democracies, almost all non former British colony democracies, have lots of visa free access except for us. So this is very, very interesting. I think it's a cultural thing. I don't know how else to explain why, because it's not like our economies are that different from that of Europe. We don't have that much more opportunity. So it's very interesting. Um, I did this interesting graph. Democracy versus GDP per capita has a bit of a exponential chart. You find you have your Gulf states here. You have Singapore there, which has a relatively lower democracy score than you'd think, but it's complicated. They have very good corruption score though. But once you hit above a democracy score of around 7, GDP per capita takes off in most cases. Now, Latin America is a bit of an exception here, but we'll get to that. That's that's mainly because mean years of education in Latin America are so low, but we're going to get to that. I've got visa free versus GDP per capita by region, and again, US, Australia, again, your British colonies. You find once you hit $20,000 of GDP per capita, you probably have a very open visa policy, except if you're a former British colony. Which is, yeah, I don't know why we have to be this way. It doesn't seem to provide that much of a security benefit. You don't see that many terrorist attacks in France or Germany. They're very rare. I mean, they're more rare than they are here in the US. But I don't know. Anglo's gonna Anglo. Um, this is the same graph again, tagging for former British colony. Saudi Arabia is a weird one. Not really a democracy at all, but also kind of British colony, but not really. It's complicated. Um, but again, same graph. We are graphing the same thing again, coding by region, just continuing to demonstrate this holds. Now, there are some countries that have low democracy scores that have relatively open visas, and that's mostly like you've got former communist states, former states that used to be in the Soviet Union, and Gulf states, and 2 African countries. This is pretty much the distinguishing factor. Former communist states and Gulf states tend to have relatively open visa policies, more than you would expect given their democracy index, which is interesting. This is the same thing again with a regression line, and you can see that overall, yes, British colonies do have more restrictive visa policies than non-former British colonies, and this is where we see, reasonable R squared, especially for not being British colony. If R squared is 0.33, which is decent, it's okay. Similar thing again we find with press freedom, and another interesting thing. If you have a press freedom score over 20, which I would consider good, if you're not former British colony, you're going to have about 100 or more countries that can travel to your country visa free. If you have a very restrictive press freedom, you're almost certainly going to have very restrictive policies. So this explains Saudi Arabia, which has a very... where's Saudi Arabia? I know they're on the right side. Well, Saudi Arabia has very poor press freedom, which I feel should be common knowledge. And their press freedom explains why, even though they're not a British colony, why they show up in that graph earlier. It's both the press freedom kicks in. It just makes sense. If you're trying to control the flow of information, you're going to restrict the press and you're going to restrict travel. That's, what we see in history. Same graph again, tagged for colonial history. We find, now I really like this graph. I'm going to turn off British and other. You get a very interesting thing here. So former Soviet states here tend to be pretty open visa policy, with the exceptions of Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. Former British colonies are a bit all over the map, except if they're high income, so it's a little more complicated. If you're looking Oman, Grenada, Fiji, these tend to be countries that are less, while they're former British colonies, they didn't adopt, a small percentage of them speak English. If you're a former British colony and you speak English, you're very likely to have, you're almost guaranteed to have a restricted visa policy, aka US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, which is what we see. New Zealand, Canada, Australia, US. These are countries that didn't adopt British culture as much. They don't speak English as much. They're less anglicized, and they have much more open visa policies. So we're going to hide Britain. We find an interesting thing here. These are our Spanish colonies, the exception of Equatorial Guinea and Cuba, which are not democracies, generally have pretty open visa policies. For the most part, you find the same thing with former communist states, tend, with 2 exceptions, Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, to have pretty open visa policies, which is kind of funny because some of these, you would not expect such an open visa policy, like Russia or Belarus. But former Spanish colonies, with the exception of Cuba and Equatorial Guinea, have very open visa policies. There are only 2 that have fewer than 50 visa-free countries. So former colonial history does seem to have a significant effect on how open or closed your visa policy is going to be. It does seem to matter. France is a little all over the map, but in general, if you're a former French colony in Africa, well, most of those countries are very corrupt, not very democratic. France didn't leave their colonies very well, and you get bad results from that. Don't be colonized by France. Bad idea. We find that trading across borders has a reasonable 0.2 R squared. It's not insignificant, but you do find it's very easy to trade across borders. Unless you're a British colony, you're probably going to have a pretty open visa policy. If you have a more restrictive trade, like Eritrea or Sudan, then you probably have more restrictive visas. But there are some exceptions: Venezuela, which is a former Spanish colony, and Angola, which is funny. Anyways, it's not a perfect fit, but it definitely does is interesting. So this is a similar graph. We find three clear groups. You have your low visa policy here. I'm going to look at this one with some colony coding. Oh, that's a different graph. We have color equals what? I think I just called it colony. Colonial history. I want some colors. Oh, nice. I like colors. Color pretty. We find more open visa policy tends to be pretty rare. It's not a super strong correlation here, but we do find clear to see Europe. This one's not so interesting. This one, however, is very interesting. Here we have press freedom, democracy, and visa free. You find here, if we zoom in, we're going to have some British colonies here. They have more restrictive visa policies, and their press freedom is mediocre, democracy is mediocre. Here's your US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are over in this area. Where's Canada? North of the United States, obviously. I'm not finding. Oh, there's Canada. There we go. We have over here low press freedom and low democracy. All of them generally have very restrictive visa policies, by and large. Like China's only 41. Here's the European Union, but not just the EU. Also like Botswana and Mauritius, Jamaica, democracies without doubt. Ireland, which is EU but not Schengen. You have a pretty clear. Oh, hold on just a second. I'm having trouble with my monitor. You find. Oh, that's an interesting graph. Is this working? Hold on. I don't think it's moving my graph very well. What's going on with my streaming here? I don't know. I'm having trouble. My streaming just stopped. I don't know why. I'm using a MacBook. It shouldn't be giving me trouble here. This is very strange. Poopy poop. Okay, I need to reset this. This is not... We're just going to do that. I'm just going to remove screen capture and do it again. Sorry about this. Bear with me here. There we go. Method, display, LG, window capture, and I want Firefox presentation. Okay. That's what... Okay, sorry about that. My computer decided not to show stuff. But again, this is a very interesting chart. We have former British colonies. Here's the European Union and other democracies. Couple, Singapore, the ever outlier in my data set. But yeah, so basically, same pattern. I'm just expressing this data over and over. You find, no matter how we look at it, this pattern persists. British colonies are an outlier. Rich, democratic, high press freedom equals no British colony equals open visa policy. This shades it with GDP per capita. The brighter it is, you find that as you become more democratic, you tend to be wealthier. I don't have data for Taiwan. And you also find as you become wealthier, you tend to have more visa free, unless if you're British. Former British colony. I'm only looking at rich countries here, same pattern. Here's the European Union and Israel, Ireland, a bunch of countries there. Same thing here, same chart. It's the same story. I'm just shading it different ways to make it clear. And feel free to pause the video if you want to really look at this. We have px.scatter, same data shaded by region. And now this is interesting. Doing mean years by schooling, which very clearly correlates with democracy, we find that by and large, more years of schooling equals more open visa policies. That's actually a very strong correlation, and that explains why former Soviet states have pretty open visa policy. They're well educated and not former British colonies. You have this big blue area here. These are most of your Spanish colonies, and Portuguese, and Brazil is right there. Tend to have lower mean years of schooling, which explains GDP per capita. But so stay in school. And then you have down here your African countries and some Asian countries. Though Asian countries span the gamut. We have similar graph again. Corruption, democracy. We do find corruption does make some impact. There are a few outliers. Your Gulf states, Hong Kong, Singapore, very open visa policies, more than you'd anticipate. But yeah, you can really see here your Gulf states, Oman, Qatar, UAE, far more open than you would anticipate. Bhutan, very closed visa policy, and yeah, bit of an outlier here. More democratic than you'd not as democratic as you'd expect. Bhutan's not as democratic as you would expect it to be. And then yeah, no, this is a cool graph. I really like this one. This chart is GDP per capita, same deal. I did a bit of a log. Did I do a log? No, I didn't. I just did GDP per capita, and it's very clear to see here are your former British colonies, here's the European Union, and the rest of countries without a log are pretty much pushed against the wall here. You have your Gulf states who are coming out there. This must be Singapore, always the outlier. And yeah, no, you really see without logging it, most countries are against the wall. Very, very interesting. This is similar, but I cut it off so you can really see the groupings. You have your British colonies, Gulf states, European Union and other democracies, and Singapore is up there. Now we're cutting it a little by democracy and corruption. You have two very clear groups. European Union and like Japan is all in here. Former British colonies are on the bottom. When you're only looking at democracies with low corruption, the trend is very, very clear in this case. So that's very, very interesting. Similar story. This is looking only at low-income countries under $20,000, and yeah, it basically eliminates the outlier we're seeing, and the trend. Let me add a trend line in here. You find 26 reasonable correlation between visa-free and democracy still, even without high-income countries. Now, this mean years of schooling and GDP per capita are, of course, very highly correlated. You find that if you want to have if you have less than 10 years of education, most countries are going to be very low income or they're Gulf states. So that money's very unequal and very concentrated in the hands of the rich. Once you get above 10 years of education, you start to have a whole bunch of countries, primarily in Europe, but also in Asia, that have very high incomes. So if you really want high GDP per capita, keep people in school, finish college. You have a few countries in Latin America that are almost at the cutoff. You see they're right here at the cusp, where the chart really bends. You have a three-dimensional bend here. And then once you get past 10 years of education, it just does a three-dimensional bend with a few outliers, Gulf states, but Yeah, aside from the Gulf states, if we remove them from the graph, it becomes very clear to see you have clear correlation. Um, High income, high wealth, go to school a long time, you're going to be fine. You have your very democratic Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Chile, but their years of schooling is still pretty low, so they don't have the GDP benefit. Here's the United States. So that's really cool. Where's Canada? Canada didn't show up for some reason. I don't know why. Anyways, and then I then did some data analysis, did some data crunching. I said, give me the latest Gini coefficient for inequality of every country in my data set. So a lot of countries got dropped, unfortunately, because Gini's inequality is one of the hardest things to measure, and there's a lot of missing data. But there's enough data present that when we do this versus homicide rate, we find this trend that's been found in the literature. There are some exceptions. Jamaica and El Salvador are more equal than you'd expect for their homicide rate, but in general, countries that have low homicide, well, Tuvalu is a bit of an outlier because it has such a small population. But generally speaking, if you have low, and I do not trust that Gini coefficient on Russia for a second. Some of the data is a little sus, but in general, it's accurate. Low Gini coefficient tends to correlate with low homicide rates. Once you get above 40, 45, that's when you start to see a clear trend up. As you see, here's where the Americas are. You have a lot of inequality, which explains the inequality in Latin America. And now I said, but what about years of schooling? Because if we go back up here, we said, oh yeah, well, we have Latin American countries, low median years of schooling, very democratic, but low incomes. Well, what if we then plugged it into a three-dimensional graph? Okay, this graph shows that education by itself is not enough to explain the homicide rate. And you find this graph here. But if you then do a three-dimensional graph, it's like, oh, let me really explore this. So these are European countries. They are low homicide, high GDP per capita, and tend to be pretty, tend to be pretty high income. And then against the wall here, we have our countries with low GDP per capita, various homicide rates, and low GDP per capita, homicide rates vary widely, and I'm going to get to this dot in a second. Spoilers. Low GDP per capita, homicide rates go all the way up and down the wall here, you see, but Gini coefficients have a wide range as well. So that's interesting. And look at this dot, the United States. The US is a complete outlier. There's no other country like us. High income, Gini coefficient is, could be better, could be worse. Bit high for an OECD country, but our homicide rate is way higher than you would expect, which is very, very interesting. Our homicide rate is 5 when it should be closer to 2 per 100,000. America is an outlier. No other country is like us, with a relatively high homicide rate, high income, and medium Gini coefficient for inequality. This is just wow. So why is our homicide rate so high? Our Gini coefficient by itself doesn't really explain it, because like America's, if you look at this graph, the United States is gonna be, right around here. So like just looking at homicide and Gini coefficient, 5.35, it kind of blends in with everything else. But once we throw in our GDP per capita, boom, we pop out. Whereas like our GDP per capita with our Gini coefficient, you would expect us to be like, I don't know, like 12,000 around Argentina. But we have this really high GDP per capita. Like Argentina's similar Gini coefficient to America, similar homicide rate, much lower income. Our income is really high for the Gini coefficient we have. And if you look at other countries with our for our income, it's weird. And I don't have a simple explanation for this. Homicide rate is way higher than you expect. It's just very, very interesting chart. How it does this three-dimensional bend. Your linear regression is not going to pick this up, but there's a clear relation between inequality, income, and homicide rate. And then there's the United States. Mind-blowing. Moving on, I want to finish up with this chart here, which I looked at and said, I gotta do a video. So let's start with just Europe. Somewhere to begin. So here's Europe. Europe spans the gamut. We have relatively high Gini coefficients, up to 40 in Bulgaria. Income, homicide rates tend to be pretty low. Let's add in the Americas. You find a pretty clear gap here between the Americas and Europe. There's no country. Here's the US. We're clearly next to Europe. But yeah, it's very. I mean, from here you can see the Gini coefficient. But then, like, Montenegro, Bulgaria are much lower income than we are. In mean years of schooling, we are where you'd expect, similar to where they are. It's just interesting. Like, this would imply we have a lower income than we have, which we clearly don't. So you can see there's a clear break between Europe and the Americas. It's like, though again, I'm missing data for Canada, which would be basically European. Oceania is kind of like Europe for the countries I have data on. Throw in Africa. Africa is a third group. You have very low education, so it separates it from the other two. Inequality is mostly inequality is pretty much on par with the Americas. But in the mean years of schooling, so you have this group here with Africa. If you throw in Asia is all over the place. You have Asia's like similar to Europe. Some of them are very similar to Europe on this chart. Some of them are getting more like Africa, like Nepal and Pakistan. And then the Philippines fits in with, another Spanish colony. The Philippines is right next to the Dominican Republic. Isn't that fascinating? And there aren't many Oceania countries. But that's the analysis for today. The long and the short of it is, what we're finding is that the United States homicide rate is a really big outlier. There's clearly a nonlinear relationship between education, GDP per capita, and democracy, and homicide rate. They are connected, but you're not going to pick this up with a linear regression. The United States has a far higher homicide rate than you would expect. There aren't really any other significant outliers in this data set. I mean, El Salvador is high, but then it's not that far out. But then the United States. That's pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. The U.S. is weird. The United States has far higher homicide rate, with a far more closed visa policy than you would expect. The closed visa policy can basically be explained by the fact that the United States is a very Anglo-dominant English-speaking culture, but our homicide rate is not explained very simply through just our It's explained, not simply explained by our inequality or our income. And it's a very big outlier, and I need to do more research and figure out like how what is it about the United States? I mean, of course there's racism, but there's racism all over the Americas and the world. Like you don't find, is it that combination of the slavery legacy combined with high income? I I don't know. That's pure possibilities. But yeah, no, that's it. Have a lovely night. I'm gonna go to bed. But no, this data set is fun to play with.